I'm George Galloway.
I'm Steve Topple.
And together we are Topple Galloway, although we're finding it more and more difficult to get together because his career is taking off.
Well.
Steve, you are everywhere. And I always knew that it would be true. And I can prove it because I said it publicly. Over and over again on radio, on television, on here. You have a unique skill set. Pretty good looking guy too. And your taste in hats is improving all the time. But now you're on the BBC on Friday.
I am.
You'll have a column in the New Internationalist, and your podcast on the Canary, which is a new departure for them, has really taken off. Everyone's talking about Topple in the Canary. How does it feel?
Oh, don't. It's all very surreal. I say this a lot, and I've said it to you before, but I'll say it again for the benefit of our viewers. I didn't ask to be famous. I didn't want any of this. My story, for people who don't know it, is I started blogging in 2015, just before the general election, because I was on benefits. I was on employment support allowance because I wasn't very well. And I've been on and off that for years and sort of in and out of the welfare state for various reasons. And I started blogging in 2015 because I'd kind of come back to politics because, as I've discussed on the show before, my father, ardent communist, very political, waving the Morning Star at me over the breakfast table every day. I had a basic knowledge of politics, but I kind of ignored it my whole adult life. So I was like, oh, I'm not interested in this. Give me capitalism. Give me capitalism. I was like,
give me bling.
Yes, I want capitalism. And I kind of woke up after sort of having several years on the ESA and being at the bottom of society. And I was like, hang on, this isn't right. I need to do something about this. And I couldn't afford to go to demos. I couldn't afford to join organisations or whatever. So I decided to start blogging. And obviously something happened there because people seem to like it. And it's actually 2 years ago this month, that is right, 2 years ago this month, 2 years ago this month, I'm trying to work it out, I did my first article for The Independent, and then the Canary came.
You're still here and The Independent isn't.
Well, I know, it's bizarre, isn't it? I started covering PMQs for them, and then suddenly the newspaper folded. I don't know what that was all about. But yeah, so started blogging, Independent came calling, RT wanted me, Al Jazeera wanted me, and the Canary wanted me. I've only been doing this properly for about 2 years.
It's pretty meteoric, but it's because you are good, but because you're unusual. I would argue unique. You can talk fast, but that's because you think fast. You're not talking gibberish. You're striking chords, multiple chords, rapidly with people. And that's why you're getting these new platforms now. So you're still on RT. You're here on Topple Galloway. You're frequently on my radio show on Talk Radio. You're going to be on the BBC on Friday. But I'm interested in this podcast, Mark.
Okay.
Tell me about that.
It kind of came from nowhere.
Why is the Canary doing that? Used to be just a written...
It did. We did do a podcast for a while, but it kind of went by the wayside for various sort of operational reasons. But the Canary came back to me and said, look, we've got this in the pipeline, we're doing this, we think it'd be a great time for you to do a podcast. To be honest, I'm sure they won't mind me saying this, they said to me, we keep seeing you on Going Underground, which is on Russia Today UK, which I'm on quite a lot.
Great show.
Ash
is
absolutely
great.
Top class. He's really smart.
Really
and so they keep seeing me on Going Underground, where I do the broken news, where I do sort of 5 stories in about 7 minutes. And they basically said to me, we forgot you're quite good at sort of telly and broadcasting, aren't you? And I was like, well, I suppose so. I just sort of roll up and get on with it, as it were. And they're like, would you like your own podcast? And I was like, oh, go on then. And then I do love the Canary, I have to say, they're brilliant. And they basically said to me that you can do whatever you want. Here we go. Here's the equipment. Here's your weekly slot. Do whatever you like. Pitch it to us, whatever you want. And they left it up to me to decide. So between myself and my girlfriend Nicola, who had a lot of input into the podcast and also helped with the editing, a lot of the ideas are hers. We came up with this format. We tried to keep it fresh, relevant. We tried to make it something different to everything else that's out there. For example, the music is grime music. I speak at quite a rate of knots, which people seem to know me for. We have a sort of fairly standard standardised format now, which is where I do a quick-fire news roundup to start with of the 5 top stories in 5 minutes. And then have a guest on to discuss 3 stories in more detail. I then have another section where I take BBC Question Time's questions from the prior Thursday, and I answer them myself.
Well, that's a change.
So I give the views that you won't hear on Question Time. And then I have a musical section at the end where I have a musical guest on, obviously with the political slant.
It's been a fantastic success, going like video, like hot cakes. And it is amazing when it's like a wave, when you feel something, when you're on something. For example, I'm doing this, as you know, this crowdfunding for the killing of David Kelly. Killing Kelly, the film's called. We're already at 27% at the time of recording. By the time you see this,
that's only been out a week.
Yeah, less than it went out at 7 p.m. on Friday night. So by 7 p.m. this Friday night, I'm sure we'll be well over a third of the way, with still 30 days to go. I mean, the money isn't collected till Boxing Day.
Yeah.
But suddenly you see and even hear people talking about what it is that you're doing. So, for example, someone met me in the barbers yesterday and said, I see you're doing a film on that suicide of Dr. David Kelly at the start of the Iraq War. Zeitgeist is the word, isn't it? Yeah. You tap into a pre-existing feeling, incoherent, unexpressed often, held by very large numbers of people. So, for example, almost nobody believes that David Kelly committed suicide in the place that it was said he did, by the means that he was claimed to have done. Almost nobody believed that. But there was nobody coming along and saying, you know, that was a crock. And here's a much more plausible set of circumstances and naming names and so on. I just feel that, I mean, first of all, we're going to well exceed our minimum target, which is obviously important. The more we raise, the better the film can be, the more archive we can purchase for the film and so on, more investigation we can do. I don't just feel that we're going to raise the money and much more. I feel that it's a film that's got legs.
I think it is. And I don't think, as you've been so kind to me, I'm going to be kind to you. You don't get half the credit you deserve for your work surrounding Tony Blair and the Labour government, not least because, I was discussing this with Nicola at the kitchen table actually, just sort of more broad strokes, but this plays into it. History is not going to view these past 20 years kindly at all. The history books are going to be damning.
And the people who collaborated with it.
Yeah, and there's only really you in a sea of conscious conspirators, almost, if you like. There's only you banging the drum about this repeatedly, and history will judge you well for what you've done.
Well, thanks.
And it needs to be done. You have to.
I always put it this way, Steve: only 3 people have lost their jobs as a result of the Iraq War catastrophe. One was Greg Dyke, the Director General of the BBC, who fell over the Kelly affair. So 4. The other was Andrew Gilligan, the reporter for the Today programme, who claimed that a source had told him that Alistair Campbell and Number 10 had sexed up the case for war. How mild that now seems as a charge. The third was Piers Morgan, the then editor of the Daily Mirror, sacked for faking up photographs of atrocities in Iraq. And the fourth was me. Fifth was David Kelly, who didn't just lose his job. He lost his life. So, thanks for the opportunity to say that. Killing Kelly is on Kickstarter. Steve is on everything. And long may it continue.
An economic catastrophe, shameful, ministers in denial, and poverty being a political choice through ideology. We're not talking about a developing country here, nor are we talking about Russia or China. We are talking about the words, not my words, the words of Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty, who concluded his fact-finding mission in the UK last week, looking into the effects of austerity and the potential impact, current and future, of universal credit. Now, of course, government ministers have rolled out rolled out denying any understanding of his report, saying we don't recognise this, and essentially it's a nonsense. Philip Alston has been very firm over this, even for a UN guy, which is quite surprising. And he's again hit back at the fact that the government is saying, no, we don't recognise the situation, none of this is true, etc., etc., etc. However, my point with this, George, with this whole situation regarding the UN report and the findings, which were essentially that poverty is rampant in the UK, that austerity has hit the poorest the hardest, that the Department for Work and Pensions specifically is leaving people destitute, and this has all been a political choice through a failed ideology of austerity, which, I mean, even the likes of the IMF have said that austerity has been a mistake in the UK. While this is all well and good, my perspective is, and none of the mainstream press have reported on this, we've been here 4 times before since June 2016. There have been 4 UN reports prior to Philip Alston's one into the UK government, one from the UN Committee on Economic, Cultural and Social Rights, one from the actual UN Human Rights Committee, and 2 from the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The latter have said that the UK government committed grave and systematic violations of disabled people's human rights, resulting in a human catastrophe for disabled people living in this country. The 2 other reports have also raised serious, not my words, the reports were serious and deep concerns about what the UK government is doing to its citizens, and the Tories brushed all these reports off before as well. So while Philip Alston's words to be welcome, my concern is it's going to go the way as 4 other reports. It's going to be ignored. The Tories will bury it under a sea of denials and blankets, claims that they're doing the right thing. So what difference this is going to make?
Well, it's nails in a coffin. They don't necessarily seem to have been paid attention to, but they have all entered the national bloodstream. They have all formed part of what is becoming a settled position, a settled will amongst the British people that the Tories are a disaster, that they cannot possibly be allowed to continue for much longer. I'll come back to that in a minute. So whilst you might necessarily, as someone, one of the top campaigners in this field, think that these things were ignored, they have had their impact. But this latest one is frankly the one I have studied the most, because I covered it in my radio show on Friday. I almost had Alston, actually.
Oh, okay.
I was waiting to go on an aeroplane. If it had been delayed even 10 minutes, I would have got one. I might get one from New York this week. Alston's figures are almost unbelievable. And to some people are unbelievable, and I want to test you on that.
Yeah.
But the one that stuck with me is that by 2020, in Britain, the 5th, 6th, 7th largest economy in the world, depending on who you believe, 62% of all children in single-parent households will be living in poverty. Yeah. Not 1 in 2, but well over 1 in 2. And of course, the devastation of growing up in poverty is something known to me. I grew up quite poor myself, but there were other people living in the council estate where I grew up who really were almost in destitution. And to say that it marked and scarred their lives is no overstatement. So children who have no responsibility for, they're not feckless, they're not work shy, they're not lead swingers, they haven't walked out of work, they're still children. And so are entirely innocent of anything that their parents might have done, choices they made or whatever, are growing up in houses which are chambers, in some cases of horrors, which are going to affect those children. So when you see a guy out on the street with a machete or a knife, or he's robbing somebody, or he's burgling somebody's house, just ponder that child, young man, might well have grown up in a house that has completely scarred and distorted the rest of their lives. So it's not charity I'm appealing for here. I'm actually appealing to people's self-interest. You have to live in the society with the children that have grown up in poverty when they are grown up. But the rest of the stats were just as horrific. 1.5 million people in Britain living in destitution. That's way more than living in poverty, but destitution, the very word, Dickensian, Oliver Twist, destitution. And about a quarter, he said, of the British population was poor. This led to my colleague at Talk Radio, Paul Ross, and I falling out, possibly terminally, because Paul Ross went on Twitter and said, well, what do you mean poverty? As compared to South Sudan? So what did he mean by that, and what's the answer to it?
But I hear this a lot, and I constantly hear this argument on Twitter, and it's such a nonsense argument. And to be honest, I have to pull my own mother up on it sometimes, because she says, well, it's not as bad. I grew up during the Second World War, and it's not as bad as then. We have televisions. Poverty is relative. You can't possibly, firstly, compare poverty in this country to poverty in South Sudan or anywhere. Of course you can't compare that. But that's not the point. The point is, it should be relative to the richest people in the country, how well off they're doing, and how well off the poorest people in the country are doing. That's the true measure. And
it's not just, though, that the poorest guy's got a less good mobile phone and a less good TV and a less good car and so on. We are talking, according to Alston, about people who are literally malnourished, some undernourished.
Yeah, I did a story.
They're not starving like the people in South Sudan, but their stomachs are filled with junk, cheap food.
Yeah, and it's comparative. It has to be comparative. We shouldn't be seeing this in Britain, as you say, the point being fifth, sixth, seventh, depending on what measure you use, richest economy in the world. We shouldn't be seeing it. I did a story about a month and a half ago at the Canary, which was a story of a woman who had been admitted to hospital and was suffering with refeeding syndrome, which is something that was seen in Japanese concentration camps and is seen in famine zones, where a person has been starved for so long that when they ingest food again for the first time, their body basically goes into shock. And it can cause heart failure and other complications. And this woman had refeeding syndrome because the DWP had stopped her benefits unnecessarily, and there was a huge mix-up with it, and she was left basically to starve to death nearly. And this is in Britain. And Paul Ross can say what he wants about it being South Sudan, etc., etc. It has to be comparative. And the fact that so many people, and there's another important point that needs to be made as well. Our measure of poverty in the UK, because the government always say this, their response to Philip Alston was that, people in absolute poverty has gone down. It's actually gone down under our government, which is fine. They changed the goalposts for the measure of child poverty back in 2015 under David Cameron to make it look a bit better. And secondly, the measure of poverty we use in this country is poverty is defined as 60% or below, 60% or above of median income. So if you're earning 60% less or more of median income, you're theoretically in poverty. The EU and the UN have repeatedly called our government out over this, saying that's not the correct measure. It should be 50% of median income, which is classed as poverty line. The government still ignore it. So even by the government's own measure, we're still actually even worse than we should be. It's just the government don't measure it properly. So the figures are completely skewed. Arguments like Paul Ross's are null and void. The bottom line is that for everything the Tory Party espouses about working people getting on, I mean, the most damning thing for them, perhaps, which undermines their whole narrative, is the fact that so many working people are in poverty, and that's set to rise. The figure currently of children in poverty, which is estimated to be 4 to 4.5 million, depending on the game, who you go by, the figure is estimated that 66% of those, 2/3, are in working households.
Yes.
Of child poverty. That's staggering.
And as you say, even by the Tories' own philosophy, if we can call it that, that you can work your way out of your background, how you came into the world. Of course, that figure kills that thesis, because if you're still in poverty, though you're working, in some cases full-time, and you want to work full-time, and you're still going into food banks, which are really soup kitchens. In the 1930s, they were called soup kitchens. You're depending on other people's charity to eat the meager amount that you do have to eat. If I saw Paul Ross here now, I'd say poverty is your arse hanging out of your trousers such you're ashamed to go to school. Your feet wet in this inclement season that we're in because your shoes are letting in. Your stomach either empty or filled with junk which is not in any way sufficient nutrition. Your clothes shabby, no books, hopelessness, no future laid out in a road that you can travel and work towards. That's what poverty is. And that's what's being suffered by millions of people in this rich country of ours.
It is, and I think there's a broader point that I want to make as well, though, that it's kind of nothing new in terms of that while it's got worse under the Conservative government, of course, we always have poverty. And again, what the mainstream press don't address, because it would ruin their agenda, is that poverty is inherent to capitalism, ultimately. When you have a system which is profit-based and which rewards the richest and allows the richest to get richer, poverty will always be there, and we seem to continue to accept it. I mean, I was literally on my arse in about 2008 under Blair's government, and the thing with poverty is, and you're quite right when you say that the man who goes and burgles someone's house or pulls a knife out to them and look at maybe where he came from, and that would be an indicator. Poverty never leaves you. Every time I go to the cash point, I still get a knot in my stomach, even if I know I've got money in there, because I spent so many years being completely broke, having nothing in my fridge, screaming down the DWP's phone line to them because I was out of toilet paper and we had nothing to wipe our arses on, even though we had no food in our bellies, so nothing was going to fucking come out anyway. And those feelings never leave you. And I was an adult when that sort of happened worse to me. I grew up we weren't rich growing up, but for me, poverty sort of really happened under Blair. And it never leaves you. I get a knot in my stomach when I go to the cash point. You constantly worry about money, even if you've got it. You don't chuck food away because you're like, well, that could be tomorrow's lunch, even though your fridge may be full. You can't ever escape those feelings. And that ultimately is the responsibility of capitalism. It's the system we live under and the hierarchy that we allow our societies to be governed by, where a few very rich people can control the rest of us and dictate to the rest of us what to do. Because that, of course, naturally lends itself to people being poor. Because when you put power in the hands of a few people, power ultimately, in most cases, corrupts. And those people are only going to be serving their own interests. And it's inherent with the system. So we will not eradicate poverty, in my opinion, until we eradicate the system that we live under.
Well, look, the Tories are falling apart as we speak. They can't get their budget through. I just leave you with this thought. Aristotle, he theorized that the richest in society should not be more than 3 times richer than the poorest in society. And to put it in another way, the last man should always be able to see the first man, and the first man must always be able to see the last man. I actually like that as a working hypothesis for how we run society. 3 times. What is it? It's probably 3 million times or 30 million times. I couldn't even begin to calculate it.
Indeed. Theresa May, read some Aristotle.
At the moment of recording, Theresa May is still Britain's Prime Minister, and the Conservatives are still in power. But it doesn't look like that's going to necessarily be for very much longer, Steve.
Oh, this bloody Brexit! I can't bloody keep up with it. Yes, no. Well, it's all going. Do you know what? I referred to this as "carry on Brexit" last week, didn't I, George? Yes. This week, the only comparison I can make is to a Looney Tunes cartoon, really, because you have sort of Porky Pig Boris Johnson nowhere to be seen anymore. You have Pepe Le Pew, Jacob Rees-Mogg letting off stinks everywhere with his talk of we will get these 48 letters. He's saying they will get the 48 letters required for no confidence vote. You have Amber Rudd coming out and saying we won't pass a no Brexit deal through Parliament. She's saying, Amber Rudd saying that no, Parliament will never vote for a no deal Brexit. The Theresa May's deal will go through.
That shocked Theresa May.
That did. It shocked Theresa May, who is sort of the Tasmanian devil in all this, swirling around in the whirlwind. She's gone off to Brussels. That shocked her. It's either my deal or it's a no deal Brexit, sort of, as you say, dichotomy down to flames. And I can exclusively reveal, George, that Topple Galloway has had access to Theresa May's conversation with Michel Barnier, and we've been given the recording, George. And Tasmanian Devil Theresa May apparently said to Michel Barnier, and that's the extent of negotiations now. But I'm just like, it's all.
She is like a toy that's running out of battery.
She is, isn't she? It's like this.
Yeah.
She's literally scooting off to Brussels today.
You wouldn't be surprised. I wish her no harm, of course.
No.
But you wouldn't be surprised to see her just suddenly keel over.
She does.
Flat on her face.
To give her a fair hearing, she looks extremely exhausted at the minute. She looks like she's...
Because she now leads the government, which for only the third time in the entire history of this country has failed to get its budget through Parliament. Last night, the Conservatives accepted all of the Labour and SNP amendments to the finance bill. Just ponder that for a minute.
Yeah.
If they'd known what they know now, Labour and the SNP could have actually demanded anything and everything.
Expropriate the stock markets.
Yeah, and the Tories would have had to let it go through because they no longer have the votes to
it's
get
absolutely
even their
mad.
own budget through. This is unprecedented. I was in Parliament almost 30 years. I've been a student of politics and Parliament for more than 50 years. This is unprecedented in all of that time.
Yeah.
Because the budget is not just a 3-line whip, it's a double 3-line whip. Everyone has to support the budget because if you don't have a budget, you're really not a government.
Yeah.
And that's now where we are. Theresa May is in office, but she's no longer in power. And so this stasis cannot persist for very much longer. So maybe Rees-Mogg will turn out to be right after all.
But this is my thing, and I'd be interested for your take on it, because while Rees-Mogg is still saying this, yes, we will get the 48 votes required, etc., etc., etc. This has been rambling on. Now, do you think that it's going to come to a no confidence vote from within her party, or do you think we'll get to a position, especially with what happened with the budget on Tuesday night, do you think we'll get to a position where her government becomes so untenable, Labour can force the government's hand, as it were? Because don't forget, Nicola Sturgeon has been she's been making manoeuvres behind the scenes. She's spoken to both Labour, she's spoken to Plaid Cymru, she's spoken to, obviously, the one Green MP, Caroline Lucas, to try and amalgamate their position on Brexit, to essentially force the government's hand. If Theresa May hasn't got the DUP's backing, will it come down to Labour and opposition parties forcing this? Or do you think it will be from within?
I really don't think so, because the positions of these different factors are mutually contradictory. So that, for example, if Corbyn took Labour in a soft Brexit direction, such that the SNP and the Liberals and so on could support it, you automatically lose any possibility of DUP support, and you automatically lose any possibility of de facto Tory Brexiteer support, because these two things are mutually exclusive. There was some overexcited commentary this week that maybe the DUP would do a deal with Labour.
No.
But
who said that?
Yeah, it's in the papers. But that cannot happen. In the Times, no less.
Oh, well, there we go then.
Paper of record. That cannot happen, not just because the DUP regard Jeremy Corbyn as officer commanding of the Provisional IRA in West Belfast sometime in the past, and maybe even until now. But it can't happen because the Brexit position of the DUP, and indeed the border position between North and South in Ireland, cannot be reconciled with the Labour position, certainly not with the Jeremy Corbyn position. So, here's the deal. The only way that the previous coalition can be reassembled is if Theresa May is replaced by someone on the Conservative side who has the confidence of the DUP and the hard Brexiteers, the ERG, the Rees-Mogg mob. And if you did that, hey presto, your parliament is secure until 2022. And believe me, that's a long time in politics. And MPs overwhelmingly are concerned about remaining to be MPs, the knowledge that one is to be hanged in the morning concentrates the mind wonderfully, as Dr. Johnson famously said. And they don't want to face that music. They want to continue. And if you say, tell you what, the whole thing could collapse if you stand by Theresa May. But if you go for any one of, 4 or 5, on the Brexit side, the DUP are right back in the fold, and the Brexiteer rebellion is ended. And the rest of you can just eat it up. And I think myself that is overwhelmingly likely the most outcome. But as Richard Bergen, the Labour MP, a likely lad, said on Twitter this morning, in these uncertain times, literally anything is possible. So don't discount Jeremy Corbyn becoming the Prime Minister of Britain. But it's much, much more likely that it's Jacob Rees-Mogg. No, I'm only joking. But one of that group.
My money is on Elizabeth McVey making another comeback, but there we go.
They actually had to think about calling security because she was so emotional.
I know, I heard, yes. Not emotional over the thousands of disabled people who've died.
That's just a mere bagatelle. We've been Topple Galloway.
We have indeed. And that's all for this week. As always, please do get in touch on Twitter. It is at Mr. Topple, at George Galloway. I'm sporting this jacket because I'm off to BBC now.
Watch him on the BBC. He's made it.
This commie infiltrator is off to get his claws into the BBC. So check me out on Friday night. I can't disclose what. But also, please support George's Kickstarter, Killing Kelly. Make sure you get involved with that. And also, don't forget Topple Uncaged from the Canaries out every Sunday. But most importantly,
this will go on forever. We're going to list all your gifts. This will go on forever.
All right. Most importantly, subscribe to Topple Galloway. Tune into this because it's free-flowing repartee here. But thank you very much as always. And until next week, take care of yourselves.
He's made it. I always knew he would.